My aunt set a box on my kitchen table the morning after Christmas, slid it toward me without a word, and walked to the window like she couldn't bear to watch me open it. I remember thinking that was strange. My aunt has never been the type to look away from anything. She's the woman who sat in the front row at my father's funeral without crying, who handled the estate paperwork before the flowers had even wilted. So when she turned her back, I knew whatever was in that box was going to change something. I was right. It changed everything. But let me back up, because you need to understand what Christmas looked like in my family before you can understand what that box meant. I am the oldest of 3 children. My brother is 2 years younger than me, and my sister is 5 years younger. We grew up in a 4-bedroom house in Columbus, Ohio, the kind of neighborhood where everyone knew everyone, and your business was everyone else's business by Tuesday. My mother worked in hospital administration. My father owned a small commercial cleaning company that he built from one van and a mop to a 12-person operation over 20 years. We were not rich, but we were solid. That word, solid, was the one my father used when he talked about our family. We are solid, he would say. That's worth more than flashy. He died 4 years ago. Heart attack, 61 years old, on a Thursday afternoon in October. I got the call while I was at my desk at work, and I drove to the hospital still wearing my lanyard, my hands shaking the whole way. By the time I got there, it was already over. What happened after is the part I've spent 4 years trying to make sense of. My mother, to her credit, handled the immediate grief with a kind of steadiness that I thought was strength. She arranged the funeral, accepted the casseroles from neighbors, wrote the thank you notes. My brother flew in from Atlanta and my sister drove up from Cincinnati. And for 1 week, we were a family in the way I remembered being a family. Eating together at the kitchen table, telling stories about Dad, staying up too late looking at old photos. Then the week ended and everyone went home. And something shifted. I can't point to the exact moment, the way you can't always point to the exact moment a season changes. But by the following spring, I had started to notice that plans were being made without me. Small things at first. My brother and sister had both come home for Mother's Day, and I found out afterward from a photo my mother posted. I called her, and she said she tried to reach me, but I checked my phone and there was nothing, no call, no text, no voicemail. I let it go. People forget. Life gets busy. Then it happened again at Thanksgiving that year, and again at Easter. And by the second Christmas after my father died, I had developed this habit of watching my mother's social media the way some people watch the weather, checking it compulsively, bracing for the forecast to turn bad. And it always did. There was always a photo. The whole family around the table. My brother's kids in their matching pajamas, my sister's husband carving the turkey, my mother laughing at something off camera. And no trace of me because I had never been invited. I want to be careful here because I know what this sounds like. I know it sounds like I'm painting myself as the victim and them as the villains. And it's more complicated than that. My mother would tell you that I was distant after Dad died. My brother would tell you that I had made things difficult during the estate process. My sister would say, has said actually to my face, that I was always the one who couldn't let things go. What they never explained was why. My father's estate was not complicated on paper. The house paid off. The cleaning company, which had been sold 6 months before he died to a competitor for just under $405,000, a life insurance policy, 2 savings accounts, a small investment portfolio his financial advisor had built over 15 years. He had a will, it was clear. Everything was to be divided equally among the 3 of us, with my mother receiving income from the estate until she chose to remarry or passed away herself. That's what the will said. What actually happened was different. I found the first discrepancy by accident, 8 months after he died. I was talking to his accountant, a man named Harold who had done my father's taxes since I was in middle school, and he mentioned something offhand about the company sale. A comment about the final number. And the number he said was not the number I had been told. The number I had been told was $310,000. The number Harold mentioned was $387,000. I asked him to repeat it. He did. He seemed to think I already knew. I drove home and sat in my car in the parking garage of my apartment building for 45 minutes. I kept doing the math. $77,000. $77,000 had gone somewhere between the actual sale and what my family had told me the sale was worth. I didn't say anything right away. I needed to be sure. I needed to understand what I was looking at before I started making accusations, because I knew that if I said something and I was wrong, or if I said something before I had proof, I would become the problem. I would be the one who couldn't let things go, the one who made everything difficult. So I was quiet. I paid an estate attorney for an hour of her time and asked her to explain to me what I should be looking for and how to get it. She told me. I followed her instructions. Over the next several months, I requested documents I was legally entitled to. Some came easily, some took letters. One required me to contact the county probate court directly. I kept all of it in a folder on my desktop labeled house stuff because I didn't want anyone who might glance at my screen to know what I was doing. By the following October, almost 2 years after my father died, I had a fairly clear picture. The company had sold for $387,000. My mother and brother had signed the closing documents. I was not informed. The amount reported to me was $310,000. The $77,000 difference had been deposited into a joint account held by my mother and my brother. The investment portfolio, which had been valued at approximately $94,000 at the time of my father's death, had been liquidated 8 months later. I received a check for my third of what I was told it was worth, $21,000. The actual value at liquidation was closer to $88,000. My third should have been nearly $29,000. The math didn't add up, and the records didn't lie. My sister, I should say, did not appear to be involved. As far as I could tell, she had received roughly what she was supposed to receive and had no knowledge of the rest. I don't know if it makes it better or worse. I sat with all of this for months. Sat with the anger. Sat with the grief underneath the anger, because the hardest part wasn't the money, though the money was real and the money mattered. The hardest part was understanding that my father had been dead for less than 2 years, and the family he had spent his whole life building had fractured along fault lines I hadn't even known existed. I stopped reaching out. I stopped calling on Sundays. I stopped sending birthday texts and responding to group messages. I didn't explain myself. I just went quiet, and I waited, and I watched to see if anyone would notice. Nobody called to ask if I was okay. Nobody drove to Columbus to check on me. The photos kept appearing on social media, Thanksgiving, Christmas, Easter, and I kept not being in them, and the only person who ever acknowledged that something was wrong was my aunt. My father's younger sister. She lives in Cleveland, about 2 hours north of me. She and my father were close in the way that some siblings are close. Not always in contact, but the kind of close that means something when it counts. She called me 3 weeks after my father's funeral just to ask how I was doing, and she was the only person outside of my own friends who did that. She had never fully meshed with my mother's side of things, which meant she existed in this separate space, adjacent to the family but not entangled in it. She started calling me more often during the second year. She could tell something was wrong even before I told her, and when I finally did tell her, in pieces, over the course of a few conversations, because I didn't even know how to say it all at once, she didn't react the way I was afraid people would react. She didn't tell me I was imagining things. She didn't say, "Are you sure?" in that tone of voice that means I think you might be wrong. She listened, and when I was done, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I need to check something. Can you give me a few weeks?" I gave her a few weeks. This is the part where I have to tell you that my father told his sister things he didn't tell anyone else. I learned this later. I didn't know it while he was alive. But apparently, in the months before he died, he had become worried. Not about his health. His heart attack was sudden and unexpected, no warning signs anyone had caught. He was worried about the business, about some conversations he'd had with my brother who had expressed interest in being involved in the sale, about some things my mother's had said regarding the estate. He hadn't been specific with my aunt, but he had been worried enough to do something. He had made a copy of every significant financial document related to the estate and put them in a sealed envelope with a note that said, "For my sister, hold until needed." He had driven to Cleveland and given it to her himself 8 months before he died. She had kept it for 3 years without opening it, because he had asked her to hold it until it was needed. And she had not been sure until I started talking to her that it was needed. When she opened it, what she found confirmed everything I had pieced together, and more. There was a copy of the actual sales agreement for the company. There were bank records my father had printed himself, showing the accounts and their balances at the time he signed the envelope. There was a handwritten note, 3 pages, my father's blocky handwriting, in which he laid out his concerns clearly and carefully, named names, and said, "If you are reading this, something went wrong. Help my daughter." By daughter, he meant me. He used my name. My aunt drove to Columbus the day after Christmas and set that box on my kitchen table. I read my father's handwriting for the first time in over 3 years. I had to stop twice. I went to the bathroom and sat on the edge of the tub and cried until there was nothing left. And then I washed my face and went back to the kitchen and read the rest. He knew, he had known, something was forming, some possibility of something going wrong, and he had loved me enough to leave me a way out of it. He had thought ahead in whatever quiet moments he'd had before a Thursday afternoon in October ended everything, and he had made sure I wouldn't be left alone with no proof and no recourse. I cannot tell you what that felt like. I don't have the words for it even now. What I can tell you is what happened next. My aunt and I spent the following week making copies of everything in that box. We drove to her attorney in Cleveland, a woman who specialized in estate litigation, and we sat in her office for 2 hours while she reviewed the documents and asked us questions. At the end of the meeting, she looked at me across the desk and said, "This is not complicated. This is actually very clear." The attorney sent a formal letter to my brother and my mother in the second week of January. The letter outlined the discrepancies we had documented and requested a response within 30 days. It cited the specific relevant statutes. It was not aggressive in tone, but it was precise in a way that left no room for misinterpretation. My brother called me 4 hours after the letter was received. I know because the letter included a read notification, and I had my phone in my hand when it went off. He did not say hello, he said, "What is this?" "It's a letter from my attorney." He said, "Why are you doing this?" "This is going to destroy the family." I said, "The family has hosted Christmas without me for 3 years. I think we have different definitions of what destroys things." He had no response to that. There was silence on the line for several seconds, and then he said my mother was very upset, and I said I understood that, and then I said I had nothing else to say and I ended the call. My sister called 2 days later. That was harder. She was crying when I picked up, which I hadn't expected, and she said she didn't know. I believed her before she called, actually. The records were clear and her name wasn't in them. She kept saying, "I'm so sorry, I didn't know," and I kept saying I know, because there was nothing else to say, because knowing doesn't undo anything, because sorry and didn't know are true things that don't actually solve anything. But I told her I loved her, and I meant it. The resolution took 8 months. That's the truth of these things. They don't end in one phone call or one letter or one dramatic moment. They end slowly, through negotiations and counteroffers and more letters, through a mediator the attorneys arranged, through a process that is boring in its details and exhausting in every other way. My mother never called me directly. I don't know what she felt. I'm not sure I'll ever know. In the end, the settlement required a payment to me that accounted for the shortfall in the company sale and the discrepancy in the investment portfolio, plus interest. There were attorney fees on both sides. My brother had to liquidate some assets. I was told this made things difficult for him, and I'm going to be honest with you. I felt something about that, but it wasn't guilt. Guilt would mean I had done something wrong, and I had not done anything wrong. The afternoon the wire transfer cleared, I was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee. Not the same table. I'd moved the year before, a bigger apartment, more light. I remember the notification coming through on my banking app and just sitting there for a minute, looking at it. My aunt called that evening. We talked for almost 2 hours. We talked about my father. We talked about what he must have been thinking when he drove to Cleveland with that envelope. We talked about the fact that he never told me he was worried, which she thought was because he didn't want to scare me, and I think she's right. He was the kind of man who carried things quietly so the people he loved didn't have to. I told her I wished he'd told me. She said she thought he knew I'd be okay even if he didn't. That I'd figure it out. That I had always been the ones in the family who figured things out. I don't know if that's true. I know that I spent 3 years feeling erased. From photos, from tables, from the story my family was telling about itself. And I know that it turned out my father had never erased me. He had, in fact, done the opposite. He had written my name down, sealed it in an envelope, and driven it 2 hours north so that someone who loved us both would be holding it when it was needed. That's the thing about the people who really see you. They don't always say it out loud while they're alive. Sometimes they just make sure the record is clear. I still have the note. All 3 pages, his handwriting. I keep it in the same box my aunt brought to my kitchen table the day after Christmas, in the closet of my new apartment. On the shelf where I can see it when I open the door. Some things you don't file away. Some things you keep where you can see them.